Hey there everyone, this is Oslin coming in with another Mythic Plus video guide for the Dawnbreaker. This will be one of the 2 dungeons in Hallowfall. Before we get started, remember to hit that like and subscribe button to stay in the loop on future content. Enemies and abilities to be aware of on the way to the Dawnbreaker itself. The Nightfall Shadow Mage will cast Ensnaring Shadows. This inflicts shadow damage on the target, followed by a dot and a 30% movement speed reduction. You'll want to interrupt this. The Nightfall Ritualist will cast Stygian Seed. This will inflict shadow damage on the target, followed by a dot, and will explode for shadow damage to targets within 8 yards of the player when it's destroyed. Add-ons like Bigwigs and Deadly Boss mods should indicate which target has this debuff, so just be sure to distance yourself. The Ritualist will also cast Tormenting Ray, which applies ticking shadow damage every second for 5 seconds. Once on board the Dawnbreaker, the Nightfall Commander can apply a 15-second shield called Abyssal Howl, which also inflicts the party with shadow damage. They also have an ability called Tainted Slash, which inflicts physical damage, followed by a bleed for 8 seconds. This debuff stacks on each application. After defeating the commander, players will receive a buff called Radiant Light. This unlocks the ability to use your Skyriding mount, allowing you to fly to one of those other airships, traveling parallel to the Dawnbreaker. A few things to keep in mind when you take flight. First, you'll face strong winds pushing against you while you're in midair. Stay steady. Second, these airships have hollow floors, so be mindful of your Skyriding energy. Don't use it all up navigating, or you may find yourself falling through. Next, watch out for the Sureki Webmage and their ability Bursting Cocoon. This ability coats the target in a bubbling thread, dealing nature damage every second, then exploding after 6 seconds. If you're within 5 yards of the affected player, you'll take damage too, and your movement speed will be slowed by 50% for 6 seconds. Once the Webmage is defeated, click on the bomb to activate it, then quickly fly off the ship and head to the airship opposite of the Dawnbreaker to repeat the process. Once you've done that, return to the Dawnbreaker to engage the first boss. The first boss in the Dawnbreaker dungeon is Speaker Shadowcrown. The primary mechanic to watch out for is Obsidian Beam, which deals significant damage to the tank and can one-shot any other player. At 100% health, the beam splits in 3 directions, and at 50% it splits into 4. To make matters more challenging, Shadowcrown will also cast Collapsing Night, targeting 2 players and opening shadow portals at their location. These will prioritize ranged targets or those furthest from the boss. The shadow zones will grow over time, so players targeted by a portal should move it to the side, keeping the central area clear for dodging Obsidian Beam. Tanks may need to reposition the boss as void zones begin to spawn. These void zones will only last for 30 seconds. Shadowcrown also casts Shadow Bolt, which can be interrupted, and Burning Shadows, which deals ticking shadow damage every half a second, while slowing movement speed by 50%. Once Burning Shadows is removed, the affected player receives the Shadow Shroud debuff, which absorbs incoming heals until a certain threshold is met. For healers, time the removal of Burning Shadows carefully to avoid leaving a player vulnerable, especially during critical mechanics. At 50% health, the boss will cast Darkness Comes, covering the ship in a massive shadow explosion. To survive, hop on your Skyriding mount and fly off the Dawnbreaker. While airborne, you'll be afflicted with encroaching shadows. To cleanse it, pick up the floating light fragments around the Dawnbreaker. If you don't collect one before encroaching shadows expires, you'll die instantly. The explosion from Darkness Comes is also lethal, if you're caught in it. Once the explosion passes, it's safe to land back on the Dawnbreaker. This phase repeats once more when Shadowcrown reaches 0% health, but by then the fight is essentially over, and you can proceed to Mereldar safely. No need to wait for the final explosion. The second boss you'll face is Anub'ikkaj. You can engage him from the start, but be aware, his damage increases by 30% and his health by 50% for each of his active lieutenants. Starting with a lieutenant by the chapel, Manifested Shadows will cast Black Hail, dealing shadow damage to any player caught in the swirlies. They'll also apply Abyssal Rot, a shadow damage over time effect, and cast Dark Flows, which inflicts group-wide AoE damage. Now let's talk about the lieutenants. The first is Excretin the Unbreakable. Her main ability, Terrifying Slam, creates a 15-yard circle around the tank, dealing shadow damage and applying a 2-second fear to anyone caught inside. except the tank. Give the tank some space to move away. She also casts Abyssal Blast, which deals stacking shadow damage over time. On our way towards the second lieutenant, we have the Nightfall Tactician. Their main ability is Black Edge, a frontal attack that deals significant shadow damage and snares targets for 9 seconds. These units also enrage, doubling their damage but reducing their movement speed by 70%. At higher difficulty levels, tanks may need to kite these enemies. The next lieutenant is Ascendant Viscoxria, who will cast Abyssal Blast, but her main ability, Shadow Decay, inflicts ticking shadow damage over time. Moving on to the third lieutenant, we have the Nightfall Darkcaster, who casts Umbral Barrier. This applies a shield to the caster, and it adds it to their permanent health upon expiration. Tacticians again cast Black Edge. Shadow Mages cast Ensnaring Shadows, again inflicting shadow damage and applying a dot for ticking shadow damage every second, and reducing their movement speed by 30% for 15 seconds. Finally, Death Screamer Ikentak, the third lieutenant, uses Dark Orb, firing a large projectile that explodes on impact. The further it travels, the less damage it deals. However, players' hit will be inflicted with shadow scars, causing shadow damage over time. After deciding how many lieutenants to defeat, you'll move on to face Anub'ikkaj. Unless you have a confident group with phenomenal spatial awareness, I would first recommend eliminating the Sareki Militant near the boss. This will give you ample space to fight Anub'ikkaj and not pull other adds in the process. Anub'ikkaj enters the battle with 50% increased health and 30% more damage based on how many lieutenants remain active. The boss has 3 key abilities you need to watch out for. The first is Dark Orb. This targets a random player, sending out a large projectile that inflicts dark scars on impact. Dark scars apply a stacking shadow damage debuff, ticking every second. The damage from Dark Orb reduces the further the projectile travels, so keep your distance. Next is Terrifying Slam. This is a tank-specific mechanic. Demon Hunters can mitigate the knockback with Glide, but keep in mind other players need to stay clear of the tank to avoid shadow damage in a 2-second fear. Shadow Decay pulses group-wide damage. This is when defensives should be used and healers need to be ready for a 5-second healing intensive. Finally, Animate Shadow spawns a wave of animated adds. Group them up and burn them down quickly with AoE. After defeating Anub'ikkaj, you'll return to the Dawnbreaker, so hop on your skywriting mount, look for the large airship in the sky, and land back on the deck. Before you face the final boss, you'll face the Nightfall Dark Architect. This isn't a difficult pull, but it does cast Usher Reinforcements, which can quickly overwhelm the group with additional troops you encountered in Mereldar. You'll need to focus down these adds, as the Architect won't wait for them to die before it ushers in more of them. Additionally, the Architect will cast Tormenting Eruption, which blasts players with shadow damage for 6 seconds. Players will need to spread out, as this pulse damage will damage others in a 5-yard radius. Lastly, just interrupt the Night Bolts. Then get ready to take on Rasha'nan. Rasha'nan will only hang out on the side of the Dawnbreaker. In Phase 1, you aren't actually meant to kill him, since the boss boasts an impressive 3.6 billion health. Instead, you need to pick up the 6 bomb barrels on the ship, then chuck them at the boss. These will appear 2 at a time. For mechanics, the boss will cast Expel Webs. This will inflict nature damage and root a player in place for 3 seconds. The key mechanic here is rolling acid. The challenge is figuring out which direction the acid will flow. It starts with a large green line and animated waves pointing left or right. When you get the debuff, run in the same direction the waves are flowing to avoid catching anyone else in the blast. When the mechanic triggers, acid waves will surge in that direction. If you're hit by the initial eruption, you'll suffer Acidic Stupor, which deals nature damage and stuns you for 1.5 seconds. Anyone caught in the path will suffer a 50% movement speed reduction and a debuff called Corrosion, which deals stacking nature damage every 1.5 seconds for 15 seconds. Next, there's Erosive Spray, a 2-second AoE channel that hits the group with nature damage. It also applies Lingering Erosion, which pulses additional nature damage every second for 8 seconds. This effect stacks, so watch out. Once you've thrown all 6 bomb barrels, Rasha'nan will take flight, heading for the Veneration Grounds. You'll need to mount up on your Skyriding mount and follow him into Phase 2, but don't forget to grab the light fragments before leaving the Dawnbreaker. Failing to do so will result in instant death from encroaching darkness. Phase 2 is pretty similar to Phase 1. Rasha'nan lands and goes into an acidic eruption and rage, dealing nature damage to all players until you interrupt it, and the damage ramps up over time. Interrupt him as soon as you land, then follow the same mechanics from Phase 1. The good news? No more Arathi bombs. Instead, Rasha'nan will cast Cinerette Strands. 2 players will get tethered to their own web cocoon on the ground, taking nature damage the longer they stay in the webbing. Break the tether quickly by running away from the cocoon, and whatever you do, don't drop it in the group.